Now I'm going to talk about the program that many targets are put through. I'm talking about something very specific. Not all targets go through this. But the tools used in this program are used against virtually all targets. So, what is it? It's a program, a highly deceptive multi-year program. I call it deceptive because it often looks like something completely different. It might look like you've deeply offended someone who sent his entire social network after you, but that's not why it is. It might look like you're a victim of an extremely vicious and secret smear campaign, but that's not it either. Maybe you think the police are sending people after you, or maybe you think criminal gangs are harassing you, or maybe you think it's Stasi-like secret police messing with your life. Maybe you've read about COINTELPRO, and that seems kind of like what it is. What I'm talking about looks like these things, it might incorporate elements of some of these things, but it isn't any of these things. It's something that can be disguised as any of these things, but something different, something pretty new. Now, I don't want to downplay the claims of stalking at the hands of several people. Stalking by groups of people is something that happens. You'll hear about this sometimes. A man might take turns with his buddies harassing an ex-girlfriend. That's a thing. It happens. But what I'm talking about is something qualitatively different. It's not stalking. It's something else. What this is, in essence, is a virtually untraceable takedown program. It's very hard to fight, partly because the program looks a lot like mental illness, and partly because you're being harassed in ways that you don't want to disclose to other people. It's made very embarrassing on purpose. There are several possible entry points and several possible outcomes. Since it's highly psychological, how things turn out depend at least partly on the inclinations of the subject. Also, what I'm about to describe doesn't explain everything. There are other secret programs, which people on the receiving end of this program are very likely to be caught up in. And to make things more complicated, once someone gets taken down with this program, he might get enrolled in those other programs, things like weapons testing or medical experiments. If a target has been painted as crazy, the authorities can get away with a lot. And sometimes the program drives people to try to kill the people they perceive to be attacking them. I don't condone this, but I understand what's going through a subject's mind when he acts out this way. The whole process is threatening, it's infuriating, or humiliating, or a combination of the three. So here's the broad outline of the whole program. At some point, you're put under surveillance. You're not told about this part. It could be years before the whole thing becomes obvious. A pretty common entry point is at step 1. In this step, which is optional, you're presented with a credible threat. Someone or some group of people who has a reason to be after you. It has to be credible. This is your own personal false flag operation, which is going to send you on a wild goose chase for years, so you have to believe the threat. The most believable kind of threat is going to involve money or property. That's an obvious motivation, especially if the amount at stake is large. Certain kinds of conflicts, usually involving money or property, can be seen coming years in advance. But it doesn't have to start like that. It could be you get into an online argument. Somehow they find out who you are in real life, or so it seems. Or maybe you snub a person in public, and so on. Your imagination at this stage is your worst enemy. You're inventing explanations in your mind to explain how it all started. Just remember, things aren't what they seem. Another entry point, things can start here, is step 2. It's very disturbing even without an obvious threat. What I'm talking about are a series of psychological operations in which you're made aware that things are going on behind your back which are unfavorable to you. It could be minor stuff, like evidence someone's coming by your place when you're not around. Again, your imagination runs wild. If you entered the program at the previous phase, you're obviously going to connect those happenings to the patsy you were provided with in the first phase. Around this time, you're also going to be made aware you're under surveillance. Someone might casually mention very personal details taken from your private activities just a few hours beforehand. Again, your mind makes the connection. Here's a great example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you go out to the porch one morning when you wake up and see an empty styrofoam coffee cup on the top step. This happens several mornings in a row. Obviously, someone is coming to your house every morning and leaving a cup there. One morning you decide to get up really early and see if you can catch them. You check the porch and there's nothing there. Oh well, so you do some chores, then you head out for the day and your heart stops. There's a styrofoam coffee cup on the roof of your car. That's an example of sensitization. You've been made aware that the coffee cup in this example is significant. Sensitization of some sort is going to happen during this phase, so you're made aware that messages can be sent to you non-verbally with subtle cues in your environment. At this point, you've been made aware of the fact that you're being watched, and someone or some group of people is messing with you. Stuff is happening behind your back. Another thing that can happen behind your back, gaslighting. Objects aren't in their expected places when you look for them. And finally, you're made aware that large numbers of people are interested in keeping tabs on you. Quite a few people. You're getting vehicles that show up wherever you go, or people who show up on foot wherever you go. Step 3. Now a new, very threatening message is sent. Large numbers of people. This is a message that's being conveyed to you. It's only a message, but it's very convincing. Are not only keeping tabs on you, but they're watching you and don't like what they see. This is going to be hammered home with a handful of exceptional episodes, demonstrations of hostility which seem very sincere. Those demonstrations are very manipulative. You're supposed to remember them and file everything you see in the hostility box. So you're going to get commentary on your private actions at this point from lots of people, sometimes in real time. Not necessarily to your face. There might be well-timed car alarms or explosions in the distance, and so on. Step 4. An extreme harassment episode. Okay, this builds on all the previous phases. You've been made aware that lots of people are watching you, they're hostile to you, and they're speaking to you through this secret language. Now things take a terrifying turn. You get an extreme harassment episode involving hundreds of people, sometimes in a single day, in a highly coordinated way. But because you've been prepared to recognize what I would call covert signs of aggression, objects and events you've been sensitized to, unusual amounts of attention from people around you, street theater, nobody else is going to notice it. So this is all very disturbing, but it's invisible to everyone else, maybe even the people participating in it. A key characteristic of an extreme harassment episode is that there's no escape, no matter what you do. You might panic and flee. People will follow you everywhere. They'll be in your face no matter where you go. You might check into a hotel to get away from it all. People will check in next door almost immediately, and your neighbors will harass you all night. Another key characteristic is betrayal. People you trusted, who didn't previously participate, will join in. This is all very memorable. No escape. Everyone's betraying you. You're supposed to internalize that. Step 5. Okay, you've been broken in. You're now your own worst enemy. This might be about a year in. You're jumping at your own shadow. What really helps with this whole thing, this illusion that's being maintained, you might be hiding in your residence and only popping out when absolutely necessary, but someone will show up almost immediately. Someone will leave subtle signs of intrusion even if you dash out just for a few minutes. This is the space invasion phase. Your personal space is being invaded. It directly follows from extreme harassment. You've made changes to your life that should make it much harder for them to get in, but somehow they get in. Depending on your situation, you might get break-ins even when you're asleep. Friends, neighbors, even family members give subtle signs that they're in on it. Maybe a group of men moves in next door or down the street. Space invasion. They're going to extraordinary lengths to get into your face. And much more disturbing stuff, other kinds of space invasions start happening. Customized television programming, electronic harassment, evidence that you're being watched, even in a windowless, dark room. Now, somewhere around here, you're going to conclude you've been uniquely singled out. Nobody in the world is getting this kind of attention. It's totally ridiculous. This is the point where many targets are led over the edge, about 1 to 4 years in. Because you're seeing this activity around you, and it seems to stem from a run-in with the wrong person, or people just seem to take a disliking to you in your neighborhood, and so on. And they're misusing government resources, and they're in your face. What else could it be? Well, I'm going to tell you. There's another step beyond that, in which the meaning of all the previous steps is made evident, but a lot of people going through the program don't see it. I'll be getting to that after I put those steps in context. If you're going through this process and you're still at the point where you're trying to gather license plate numbers, or catch people in the act of breaking in, or trying to find a lock they can't pick, or trying to figure out what group everyone belongs to, or trying to learn how they're communicating, I'm going to break the bad news to you. You've been brainwashed. Brainwashed people don't know they've been brainwashed. There's no explanation I can give you that's going to snap you out of it. It's so real. In fact, explaining things in terms of the familiar might actually help cement your brainwashing. The only way I know of to break brainwashed people out of their brainwashing is to confront them with propositions that can't be considered without questioning perceived reality. When you start questioning the world around you, you're on the road to recovery. The first thing I want to do is point out that this whole thing, what I've described so far, is a lot like a magic trick. There's a couple of ways, actually, in which it resembles a magic trick. First, appearances can be deceiving. An analogy I like to use is the stage trick where a magician saws his assistant in half, or rather, that's how it appears. You've seen this, right? Well, when you see that kind of magic trick, you don't go running to the authorities to report an attempted murder, do you? Because if you did, you'd be laughed out of the police station. No, you think, oh my, that's so very clever, how did they do that? Maybe when you see a really good magic trick, you'll go running to a friend, someone whose opinion you respect, and ask, how did he do that? Chances are he won't be able to tell you, because he's only going off what you're telling him and your senses were deceived. Plus, he's not a professional magician. Now, because you've been exposed to highly deceptive behavior in the context of hostility, you don't see this as entertainment. You're not looking at it as a kind of magic trick. You're assuming that everything is exactly as you perceive it to be, and you're acting on that assumption, which will turn out to be ruinous. Maybe you're running to the authorities to report what you perceive as a fact. I've gotten better at deciphering the magic tricks that are used by our adversaries, but I don't know them all. You might come on to conference calls and ask, how did they do that? Or why are they doing that? There's a chance everyone will say they don't know. They're going off what you're describing to them, and what you're describing is what you've seen with your own eyes, and your eyes have been deceived. To see through a magician's tricks, you have to adopt a particular kind of mindset. That brings me to the second way in which the whole process resembles a magic act. In the steps of the program I've gone through so far, if you've been through those steps, you're probably nodding your head. Oh yes, that's what they did to me too. And that's the trick. In describing those stages, I was focusing on what you were focusing on. This idea that there's an objective reality, which you're watching and reporting on, in which all these things are happening which pertain to you. Your attention has been drawn to these things. I'm encouraging you to look at magic tricks, sleights of hand, with a new eye. When a magician is doing something tricky right in front of your face, there's going to be a distraction. One of his hands will be going through complicated motions, for instance. All that showmanship, all the patter, it's intended to keep you focused on a distraction while the real trick happens elsewhere. You want to look for the real trick and ignore the distraction. Instead of focusing on all the details of your environment, maybe you should pay attention to yourself. How much of this are you doing to yourself? Think about all the stress you've been through. Is the stress causing you to see things around you in a different way? Review the entire program. Instead of focusing on what they've been telling you, that you're guilty of something, or that your actions are hateful or ridiculous, or that lots of people are watching, or that you're in great danger, focus on how you're being manipulated. Look at the messages you're being sent, not individual episodes, but the big picture. Like, let's say you frequently overhear neighbors saying nasty things about you. Rather than focusing on those things, focus on the message. You're being told your neighbor has it in for you. Someone else, the person or organization that's running the whole thing, is sending you that message and messages like it. Those messages are very believable. You wouldn't believe that someone else, a third party, was counterfeiting those messages. It's why the whole brainwashing process is so effective. Once you start paying attention to what kinds of provocative messages are being sent to you, you can start resisting the psychological manipulation. Of course, manipulation is generally only effective when it's disguised as something else. Nobody's going to tell you, I'm going to get you to believe this and that and the other thing, and here's how I'm going to do it. They're just going to set out to make you believe those things. You only figure out that you've been deceived later. One way in which you've been fooled, that should be obvious, is the surveillance. You might have been watched long before you were made aware you were being watched. You were deceived that whole time. Here's something else to think about. You've been deceived about other aspects of your ordeal. Like, for instance, maybe you think you've deeply offended someone, and that's why his friends are all after you. Maybe you really did offend someone, but someone else, the third party who's really responsible for the whole thing and was watching all along, took advantage of this conflict to pin everything on that person. The things you've seen were intended to be seen. This whole process is meant to be seen. You're being manipulated. Maybe you've seen street theater, obvious performances out in public where people are referring to your private activities. And that's very disturbing or even humiliating, because you imagine that everyone else notices the street theater, and so this is like a form of public humiliation. Well, those are obvious performances. You're being told, look at this, we're putting on a show just for you. Pay attention. What if you've seen other performances that you didn't recognize as performances because they didn't tell you they were putting on an act? You might think there are vicious smears or rumors circulating about you based on hints that people drop in your presence. But how does this go on for years without you finding out what the rumors are? Something else is going on. These hints that people are sharing with you are part of the performance, an act, a show. Are you starting to get the picture? If you've seen street theater, you've seen a crack in this synthetic reality they're creating for you. There may have been other theatrical episodes and you didn't recognize them as such at the time, but you remember those episodes and your views were changed as a result of them. Those episodes, totally staged, assisted with your brainwashing. That's why I keep talking about manipulation and messages that are being sent, the meaning that you assign to the strange occurrences around you. And those occurrences are really happening, don't get me wrong. It's largely in your head. You were sent messages and you internalize those messages. Those messages help brainwash you. Now, the methods that are used to send those messages, those are disturbing. All those people, they have to be in on it. It's so real. How could it be anything other than what you think it is? In the final step of the program, which some subjects never get to or haven't gotten to yet, and many of them misinterpret, a much simpler explanation manifests. It's an explanation that looks a lot like mental illness, but it's something else. And keep in mind, all the stuff I've been talking about in the previous steps looks like mental illness too. Virtually every tactic corresponds to some symptom of mental illness. There's a region of the brain corresponding to each symptom, which can malfunction and cause those distorted perceptions. But a real mental illness doesn't hop from region to region of the brain the way this program does. Before I explain the final step and what it means, and go on to explain the tools they use to make all this stuff happen, I want to point out that there is no authoritative information on this subject. Any books that are out there are self-published. For instance, one book which is a favorite because it seems to offer vindication blames it all on vigilante gangs hired by corporations. But that book's self-published. The author is allowing you to think he has credentials he doesn't really appear to have, and it's completely lacking in any concrete allegations. It's basically just another tall tale, except you have to pay $20 for it. All the books out there on the subject and related matters are based on hearsay and speculation, or even flat-out lies. People believe the lies because they desperately want any kind of vindication. As long as the author seems to have credentials, they'll swallow any story that seems to match what they're going through. Those books are the author's interpretations of this program. Their interpretations. This is my interpretation, which is no less authoritative than theirs. Okay, in the final step, you get obvious electronic harassment. This is something that's labeled as electronic harassment because it's something that could only be coming from electromagnetic sources at the speed of light. The feedback is instantaneous, or nearly so. Now, there might have been electronic harassment in earlier stages, and there probably was, but it wasn't made obvious. Or maybe it was obvious, but it seemed like something the people after you, or rather, the people you thought were after you, could get their hands on. And again, there is deception here. Just as in the previous phases, where you got obvious, overt, in-your-face hostility with covert aggression later linked to it, you might get real bombardment with energy weapons. Later you'll be getting something else, but you'll think it's the energy weapons that were used earlier. At this point, all the pieces are in front of you. You just don't recognize it yet, but it's going to get increasingly obvious. You're going to be made aware that your mind is being read. This is quite shocking when you learn about it. Unfortunately, it seems, you're not allowed to know what's really happening until you're completely broke. There's a reason why everyone complaining about these things is destitute, or nearly so. That's something I'm going to get into a little bit later when I talk about the purpose of these activities. You're also going to learn about mind-invasive technology. And again, this is something you only learn about on their schedule. You learn it because they're allowing you to know. Now, the tools of electronic harassment you've heard about on the news in the past few years, the non-lethal weapons, those are actually more advanced than mind-invasive technology based on implants, for instance. Experimentation with electronic mind control goes back to the 1950s with civilian researchers. They were doing amazing stuff more than half a century ago. The non-lethal weapons are relatively new. You could say, oh, but there's all kinds of secret stuff the military planners and intelligence agencies don't let us know about. There could be even more advanced stuff out there. Or the non-lethal weapons might have been around for a much longer time. I'm not going to disagree that the official timelines for the deployment of non-lethal weapon technology are questionable. But then, so are the official timelines for the deployment of electronic mind control technology. Someone with the ability to send electrical signals to your brain can pull off a pretty convincing imitation of God. This is an age-old game. People in authority pretending to be much more powerful than they really are, while at the same time holding back their secret edge. What you've discovered, thanks to this program, is their secret edge, the electronic mind control technology that's usable on you and on the people around you. Most of those people that you thought were in on it, even allowing for the fact that you are jumping at your own shadow, let's look at the people who are in your face, they have no idea of the significance of the things they were doing. It was discovered decades ago that electronic mind control test subjects rationalize away evoked actions. The conscious mind invents an explanation for why you did what you just did. You can't know about this except indirectly, through coincidences that are created through your own actions. Highly improbable coincidences. Once the mind control technology is on the table, you've got your explanation for the whole thing. There might have been some real hostility or aggression at the beginning, but that was amplified 1,000-fold through the use of psychological operations, these manipulative messages I've been talking about in the previous steps, and mind control technology used to make people around you deliver those messages. You're not confronted with hundreds or thousands of hostile people. It's more like a very small number of people who can, in effect, hop into a person's body and make him act out. And that person who acts out, he has no idea that his actions or words are significant to you. That's why they're using so many double meanings or subtle hints. You fly off the handle because you think some guy is hostile to you, but he has no idea why you're mad at him. From his point of view, your erratic behavior is unprovoked. That's a deliberate strategy. Okay, so that's the broad outline of the program. I'll be getting into the tools a little bit later. But first, let me point out there are things that will happen to a target of this program which don't fit into this framework I've laid out. The whole thing is highly psychological and highly deceptive. But there are things that happen to at least some targets that aren't psychological. As I said earlier, the whole thing might have seemed to grow out of a confrontation you had, or it might seem like someone took offense to something you did and got his buddies to go after you. Or it might seem like there was a smear campaign. Well, maybe there was, especially in the beginning. I've heard tales of gunplay in the beginning, of physical assaults. People don't do that stuff just because someone's whispering in their ear. The really rough treatment, you're going to find there's an incentive for it. Money is a typical motivation. It's hard to say where the real thing ends and the purely psychological factors begin. That's a question only you can answer, and you have to reevaluate everything based on what you know now. Learning about this secret world is like recovering from amnesia. You have to rebuild your conclusions from the ground up. Also, energy weapon abuse and other kinds of electronic harassment that don't have anything to do with mind control might be used. That's going to depend on the resources available. For instance, I've heard reports from a handful of targets living with military bases close by that suggest infrared spotlights are being shined into their homes, heating everything up. I've heard from a Robert Tanzi in Texas who had a neighbor set up a microwave emitter in a nearby shed. He knows it was microwaves because he measured them, and there were lots of shorts and electrical fires near his residence attributed to that emitter. But energy weapon abuse doesn't seem to be specifically part of this program. That's just something that can be used, depending on the resources available. If you're experiencing what you think is directed energy weapon torture, and it doesn't seem to be leaving any traces behind, you should be questioning whether things are happening as you think they are. And sometimes, even if it does leave traces behind. The laws of physics put some pretty strict boundaries on what can be done with energy weapons. If you've heard of the 95 gigahertz active denial system, look up the CBS video on the subject sometime. You'll see a man blocking this high-tech weapon system with a board of plywood. High-frequency radiation, up to X-rays, is easily blocked. Microwave radiation, at intensities powerful enough to cause pain, you should be able to deflect it with plain old aluminum foil. And here's a fun experiment. Put a crumpled piece of aluminum foil in your microwave oven and it's set on high. Notice the sparks and the arcing? You should see those kinds of sparks or arcing if you're holding up a piece of aluminum foil in the path of an alleged microwave energy weapon. Aluminum foil can theoretically block radio wave frequencies down to 1 megahertz. Even stainless steel window screens can block radio wave frequencies as low as a few megahertz and into the tens of gigahertz on the high end. I don't consider low-frequency radio signals to be a credible explanation for what targets are complaining about. Okay, now for the tools. There are 4 basic kinds of tools used to further the goals of this program. There's a mind control, mind-reading infrastructure, a reasonably small number of operatives, a collection of standardized tricks, and a disinformation ecosystem, which is there to mislead you as well as discredit you. First, this infrastructure. There's no reliable or authoritative information about how it works. There's just layers upon layers of disinformation, speculation, and wishful thinking. Without saying how it works, I'm just going to point out that it seems to be usable on many people, not just the targets complaining about it. but it's a big stretch to say that it's usable on everyone. You might be in a heavily controlled area. You might have been moving around to get away, and without realizing it, you were herded into other heavily controlled areas. You're not going to get me to say that it's usable on everyone. So, the infrastructure is used on people around you to get them to act out, to help them give signs they're in on it, to herd people into your area so it looks like there's always someone watching you. Keep in mind, this isn't the only thing the mind control infrastructure is used for. Just the fact that it exists should be creepy enough without the rumored applications. In case you haven't figured this out yet, you've stumbled across something much bigger than just a few losers harassing you. Okay, there's also going to be stuff that happens which can't be pinned on mind control. Break-ins that happen when you're not around, for example. This can be pulled off with a small number of operatives. They've got other things to do. You're probably just one of the many jobs in the area. And those operatives probably aren't around for long. Just long enough to introduce you to the notion that people are actively messing with your property when you're not looking. That really helps out with some of the tricks that are pulled on you later. Next, there's a collection of standardized tricks. I can go over them. I could spend a couple of hours listing tricks, but as I was saying earlier, you have to adopt a mindset. Good tricks will often involve a distraction. You have to look beyond the distraction. This is hard, but it gets easier when you're aware you're being tricked. But you also have to be aware that mind control technology adds a new dimension to the tricks used. I've gone over many tricks of this nature on a previous podcast, the Sleight of Mind podcast. Let me rehash a couple of them now. Going back to this concept of operatives moving in nearby, remember, I said one purpose of the operatives is to teach you that people are breaking into your place. So when you wake up one morning and you find evidence someone's gotten in during the night, let's say a couple of objects have been moved around, you're going to attribute that to break-in artists. There are other possibilities, such as the objects had already been moved before you went to sleep for the night, and you didn't notice because it was dark. But let's say you've ruled that out. Maybe you were mind controlled to move the objects yourself in your sleep. But you attribute it to break-in artists who are somehow able to climb into top-story windows in the middle of the night in a residential neighborhood without anyone noticing. It's baffling to you, and it sounds crazy to others. Another one, a big category of tricks, is one that I call causality inversion. You do something and there seems to be a major reaction to it, on television for example. And you're thinking, my God, the amount of manpower devoted to this must be huge. They have connections everywhere. But no, your handler had advanced knowledge of this major event and made you act it out in advance using mind control technology. Another one that I just dissected recently, this idea of energy weapons that seem to act like lasers, burning the surface of the skin with precise placement, but can somehow penetrate through walls in a windowless room and can track you even if you try to escape. Now, this shouldn't be possible, but there's a couple of explanations. The first is that you were actually burned some time ago, painlessly, and then mind control technology was used to give you pain in that area of the body. The second possibility, do you know how secure your living quarters are? Are you sure nobody's getting to you at night? Because what could be happening is, maybe there's some metal granules or particles that have been injected under your skin where the burns are going to appear. Then they just send a relatively low-power microwave beam into your residence, which the rest of your body doesn't really feel. But it superheats the surface of those metal particles. Read up on the skin effect. So, the microwave beam goes through the wall and hits a wide swath of your body, only superheating the portion of your body where those metal particles are, burning your skin in a precise pattern. Okay, so those are some tricks. There are many more, far too many to cover on this call. The fourth tool used in this program is a disinformation ecosystem. It's there to mislead you and to mislead the public about you. It's enormous. I can't debunk all the disinformation you're going to confront on this call or even in my lifetime. That's because one of the biggest sources of disinformation is you. Disinformation spreads because it gives people something they want. What targets want is official acknowledgement of their problems, vindication. So they're going to spread anything that looks like an official source, anything written by someone who looks like an authority, anything that looks like it's talking about their problems in a credible way. There is no reliable, authoritative information about these matters. You might think there is, but no. All that's out there is speculation, flat-out fabrication, and the testimony of targets like you who have gotten their information from the least trustworthy people in the world, their handlers. You're going to see targets used to scapegoat other groups, to pin the blame for these operations on other groups. You're going to run into targets who are convinced of supernatural forces, or ETs, that are responsible. It's all based on what they've been allowed to see, with confirmation provided by other people who have been hoodwinked. Now, the public in the past was occasionally allowed a glimpse into the ecosystem. These days, it's more than occasionally. It's being put in their faces. It's been turned into a form of entertainment, profitable entertainment. It's a disinformation ecosystem. It's colossal, and the only way you're going to disengage from it is to adopt this mindset that I keep harping on. Understand that deception is the name of the game. Look beyond the distractions. Don't let yourself be put to work on their edifice of disinformation. If they can't profit from using you this way, they're going to let you go. Targets play another part in this ecosystem, an important part. They're kept apart on purpose. They're forced to communicate verbally, and words are misleading. Most people don't look for the truth beyond the words. People on the calls toss around phrases like energy weapons, but when you dig in to find out what they're really talking about, a lot of the time they're talking about something else. Targets are used to terrorize other targets. Earlier, I said energy weapons and other kinds of physical assaults don't seem to be specifically part of this program. It seems to be mostly about psychology and mind control. But maybe there are targets who are in this program and some other program at the same time. Or maybe part of the grand strategy is to single out a few targets for special treatment, hard targeting. Those heavily targeted people are driven onto the calls to terrify other targets. It's like 9/11. 3,000 people were killed in a very visible way to terrorize and control 300 million people. Terrorism is a strategy that happens to work. All right, coming into the final stretch here. What is the purpose of this program? I've already said that it's a takedown program, but why are they taking you down? Well, if you've already been through a couple of years of this, maybe it started with an argument at a bar. But you've probably figured out by now that the hundreds of people following you, the electronic harassment happening for years and in several states, that doesn't have anything to do with a bar argument. Maybe you were led to believe it was about money. That's pretty credible at first, especially if it's a large sum of money. But at some point you have to realize, okay, there's no possible payoff that would get all those people watching you and following you for years on end. Something else is going on. The stories you were led to believe about why you were targeted are probably just as much of a lie as everything else you've been told. But if you believe those stories, that really helps with the discreditation process, especially if you're saying it's about an invention, or research you were doing, or your art. Trying to answer the question, why me, will lead you to an answer that sounds like mental illness, delusions of grandeur. Now, I'm aware of some targets who really are special and really have to be kept down using this takedown program. But I think those cases are an exception. To get an answer, you have to look at the whole system. The purpose of a system is what the system does. When you look at the efforts that go into demonizing targets of mind control abuse, you've even got Rachel Maddow putting on a tinfoil hat on a major network to portray an opponent as mentally ill, you start getting an idea. There's an old saying, follow the money. In today's world, that saying should be updated. Follow the ridicule. Distraction, disinformation, that's the way their game works. They build straw men with one hand and demolish them with the other, to distract people from the real issues. The overall purpose of the program, and remember, it is only one program that's used against a relatively small number of people, is to make anyone trying to expose operations pertaining to mind control in the US look ridiculous. They want you on the conference calls. They want you sharing stories with each other. They want you to rush to the public with misleading or outlandish explanations of these problems. That's the real purpose of the program. This isn't a grand unified theory of targeting. I just want to make that clear. This is one specific program that many regulars on my call have been through. Some of those regulars have been through other programs. Some of them are being taken down for nefarious purposes. If you've been through the program, the entire thing or nearly the entire thing, now you know the truth about what can be done with electronic mind control. And now you know where they get their power, from their ability to grab your attention. If you're still struggling with neighborhood harassers or friends and family members who seem to be in on it, just keep in mind, things aren't necessarily as they seem.